is the second part, and I'm going to radically switch gears here. So that was kind of theoretical, higher level. Now we're going to get into the weeds, and we're going to talk about financial and growth modeling and some of the foundational elements that I think many startups skip or overlook, and maybe there's not a lot of consistency to. So we're trying to bring a little bit of consistency to this. For those of you that are in the launch accelerator, when I get into the growth model side of things here, this is actually the same exact playbook that you all will use in your programs. For those of you who have a model already, hopefully we give you some new ways to think about it. So really, I think about kind of these three core components of a growth framework: financial model, growth model, and IO model. And I'll kind of walk through each of these in detail. We'll really focus on the growth framework today. So, and this is going to go it's going to start fairly high level, and then we'll get more and more into the weeds, and we'll look at spreadsheets and stuff like that as we go. But a growth framework includes three main components: your financial model, your growth model, and basically your inputs, actions, and the outcomes of those actions. And so modularly thinking, we're going to start with this financial model. So startups have to have a financial model to quantify your growth efforts across the company. And this often becomes something that we've built in a spreadsheet, or maybe we don't even have, or maybe an accountant built it for us. And if an accountant built your financial model for you, it probably is not going to work for growing your startup, because accountants are generally not growth people, and they're not generally founders who understand the ins and outs of startup growth. So I'll present you with like a bunch of assets that you can download and you can edit and manipulate on your own. But the growth model expands on this financial model by adding in your budget, your customer acquisition cost, and something we call a growth rate. And you're going to look at this probably every week when you're growing your startup. And then your inputs, actions, and outcomes, basically, it's an exercise to help you think through, well, I've set up this growth model. How do I actually go and grow? What are the actions that I need to take to actually support the model? And as we learned through this program, a lot of that will come from paid acquisition, organic acquisition, customer discovery, organic search, content strategy. So there's all these different actions that you're going to take. Could be that you're doing product-led growth and you're leveraging the product for that. So all of those things will compound and help kind of formalize the model. So we start with the financial model because this is the anchor by which you base your future decisions off of. We're not going to get this perfect, by the way, but by setting your revenue targets early, you're going to form some high-level goals that you're going to work towards. And so every business kind of has these four components. What are you trying to do? Like in English, what have you set out to do as a company? What does your revenue map look like? What are your unit economics? And then what are the actual targets that you need to go after to support your model? And kind of just a fancier way to look at it is kind of like the narrative is kind of the foundational element, moving up all the way to your targets. So your narrative, this is a simple statement that encapsulates your company growth goals. And I believe that this is really important to do, and a lot of us skip this early on. But if you skip it, you don't really know what you're growing towards. And so this should be something aspirational. So for your startup, think about what great success is going to look like for you and over what period of time. So for GrowthU, we want to reach 10 million in annual revenue in 5 years by scaling a membership community that helps startups grow faster and smarter. That's it. Now I can use that in an investor pitch, but I can also use it aspirationally in our weekly team meeting. If we need to think about what is our long-term goal, we can go back to this narrative. Now this narrative may change every year based on what we're learning about our business, but we needed to start somewhere. So we did. Now there's a revenue goal, a timeline, and a qualitative impact. Again, this is a business. There's humans involved. So what's the qualitative impact? Revenue is 10 million, timeline is 5 years, and impact is part of kind of our core value: build the #1 global community where founders and startups come to grow together. So you see, this is kind of a blend of like your mission statement and some operating principles sprinkled in with some revenue targets and a timeline. Just helps you keep yourself accountable. If you do this, this is not a replacement for OKRs or other high-level planning, but it's going to force you to be explicit about your revenue goals. It's going to have you set a finite timeline to focus your people on, and it's going to have an aspirational long-term goal. And so kind of you can worksheet this, but this is basically like the worksheet view. Again, this will all be available as a download after. Okay, so we did that first. Now what we want to do is say, okay, well, great. I mean, 10 million in 5 years. What do we actually need to do this year? Right? What do we need to do this year? What do we need to do next year? How do I get to that 10 million in 5 years? Or if your model is a consumer model, it might be hitting a certain metric for user growth. So if I hit 650,000 in year one and then double revenue every year, I can hit my goal. If I do 225K in year one and have modest growth, I can accelerate. I'm going to need to accelerate my growth. And if I've got a chunky revenue model, which happens to a lot of our startups, where we think we're going to have some amount of revenue or some amount of user growth is interchangeable with revenue, by the way. When I'm talking about revenue, like you can swap it out if you're a B2C company and you're not yet monetizing. Think about the same types of things, but think about it, quantify it as a set of users. Most of us, it doesn't go the way we always think, and we have to accelerate our growth later on. So this is the beautiful double revenue every year. Everything looks great. I get to 10 million by simply just doubling my revenue. Slower year one and year two, you see I have to actually, like in year 4 and 5, I have to have 200 and 250% annual growth. That's very aggressive growth. So again, if you've raised money or you're raising money and you put together this narrative and you say like you're going to become a $100 million company, your investors will hold you accountable for the subset of that, which is like, well, how did you get to 10? How do you get to 10? Can you clearly articulate what that's going to be? And if you're hiring people, you want to be able to speak to this as well. And then chunky revenue, this is kind of like what it more generally looks like. You've got rapid growth and then it dips and then it's better and you figure some stuff out and then you've got a tough year and then maybe the next year gets a little bit better. And it's just kind of like this roller coaster. Just be prepared for this, right? Side by side, it kind of looks like this. We all get to the same end game, but we've got vastly different strategies that are going to play into each of these financial models. And so when you're doing this, your company culture and your funding state is going to really dictate how aggressive you think you can be. I'm fairly confident we can get to that 10 million in revenue in year 5, because as a company, we've decided we're going to raise capital. We'll probably raise another round of capital. We're a little less worried about like profitability. We can invest more in acquisition right now versus some of you that might be bootstrapping have a totally different set of needs. So that model is going to look quite different than the model that you see here. And don't worry about perfection. You can update this on a monthly or annual basis. What you're really going for is a baseline. And when you start to think about like your narrative in play, like here's 3 different scenarios that you can look at. Okay, so moving a little bit deeper. The next thing you need to do, so again, starting aspirational, starting to get more into the weeds, you need to start thinking about your unit economics. How much do you need to sell in order to reach your goals? How many users do you need to get to actually hit your goals on the user side? Okay, that's what's going to become important. So in year 1, you want to set some goals that gives you a range that you can work with. So in year 1, my year 1 revenue is between 100 and 650K. Well, how do I actually get there? So is my model transactional, where people pay 1 or more times for something? Is it a subscription where they pay once per unit of time? Is it hourly or retainer based? What is that? How much do you charge per hour? How much is a single purchase? How much for a subscription? What do you charge per hour or per month if you're a service business? And what you can start to do is map out, okay, well, here's what I have in terms of my price per unit and my targets. How many things do I need to sell in a year to reach my goal? And doing it this way really enables you to quantify what that sales process is going to have to be to just hit your metrics. And again, most of us skip this step. So we work with a set of metrics that we don't fully understand. There's a lot of variance there, right? So going back, I said that I'm comfortable with these 3 different models. So the 3 different models means that I have to, I'm so sorry. I have a Google voice call coming in. And when this happens, I don't actually know how to turn it off. So I'm going to just filibuster my time here and then I'll have to figure it out after. But I'll pause here for 1 second if people want to get a drink. My apologies. Should end right now. There we go. Okay, so I'm going to redo this. So basically in my model, I've got some variance, right? So I've got model 1, 2, and 3 that have wildly different units sold to hit the different revenue targets that make my business solvable. And so that difference though is major, right? And so what you want to do is set year 1 targets. So I'm going to go somewhere between my mid and high range model because I feel like I can, I could be fairly aggressive with growth. And I'll answer questions afterwards. There's a lot of variance in these models, and I think it'll make more sense as we kind of move through some of the growth model stuff. But if my target is 500K for year 1, I need to sell 500 units at $1,000 to do that. So now I start to quantify. It's like, okay, well, how do I sell 500 units? And now it's going to get me thinking about my acquisition models, but it gives me a starting point. You plug this into your revenue model and you spit out your output, and then you can move to actual growth model. So the whole point of like going through that is to just get to a point where you can clearly articulate and quantify basically, what do I need to do in the next year for this to be a viable business, for me to do the hiring I need, for me to raise the capital, for me to be personally invested in it. And you have to look at it at the end of the day at a unit economic basis. It's the way you have to do it. And again, if you're a user-centric company, you're probably going to need to start to figure out your revenue model based on user consumption at some point. You may not have to worry about it yet. So we move into the growth model side of things. Once we understand those revenue goals, we can start to build this growth model. And so what I love about this is it forces you to think about, okay, well, how do I get this metric? How do I hit this 500K? And there's a few components of the growth model. There's a cost per unit. There's the number of units sold in a period of time. There's your monthly growth rate. And then for subscriptions, you're going to have number of total active subscribers, which basically you carry that number through your model. And then your churn per unit of time. Usually it's a monthly basis. Okay. And so you kind of take that and then you apply your growth rate. So what your growth rate is it measures how much you think you can grow month over month. And this will help you determine what revenue or what user growth to expect over what amount of time, how much budget you're going to need to hit to get your targets within a given month, and then how you're going to actually think about going after customers and drive that customer acquisition model. And again, this whole program will build on itself. So like we'll get into customer acquisition, but you need to have the starting points first. Now, when I'm thinking about a growth rate, how much do I need to grow my business every single month? I think about 10 to 20%. I want to grow. It doesn't matter if it's a service business or an agency or a subscription model or a consumer SaaS company or an enterprise SaaS company or a consumer product. 10 to 20% is healthy growth. That's the magical number that investors love. It's the magical numbers that early stage team members love, right? It gives you something that's aggressive, but not too over the top. So that's what I generally look at. And again, most investors are going to want to see 10 to 20% at a minimum. Now, you're going to have some spiky months. That's totally okay. You might have a 3% month. You might have a 30% month. You might have a couple fives. You might have a 25. That's okay. But when you look at your growth rate, that compounding growth rate over a year, and you look back on it, most of the companies that kind of are getting funding or are successfully bootstrapping are above that 10%. So if you're not there, let's figure out like how to get you there. And if you're over that, congratulations, like you're in the elite group. Some businesses are a lot more chunky, so just keep that in mind. Now, the monthly growth rate is probably the most common metric that we'll use. So questions might be, for example, what's your month over month growth? How many new users do you need in a month to support your model? And what's your churn per month? And then how fast can you grow with a budget based on what your customer acquisition cost is? All of these things kind of like swirl and come into play. So how do we quantify this? Okay, so the way I like to look at this is these variables. So these are inputs to your model. Price per unit, again, it's monthly growth rate, it's starting purchases, and then it's customer acquisition cost. So this would be what it looks like for a transactional model. And so let's model this out a little bit. So this is a forward-looking 12-month growth model. And this spreadsheet, each iteration of what I'll show you today is available in the learning platform in WordPress as an Excel spreadsheet. I like to put them into Google Sheets and then share with my team, and we kind of collaborate that way. But this is the exact model that we use at GrowthU with some modifications and that all the launch companies uses. And we're trying to build some standardization around this. Growth rate, new subscribers, revenue, marketing budget. So I'll let you kind of look at this for a second. What's happening here? I'm saying that I can grow this business 12.5% every month. What does that mean? It means that to hit my model, I need to have 20 new subscribers in month 1, 23 in month 2, 25 in month 3. You can see how that starts to compound. That 12.5% means that it's not just 20, that's your starting point. You now take on the burden of having to figure out how to get net new customers that are compounding over time. And then I like to factor in things like my marketing budget. Again, this is not meant to replace a P&L, but I want to get a sense just directionally. What's my revenue based on what I think? What's my budget going to need to be? What are my capital needs? What does my hiring look like? So in the subscription model, we add in this cost per month basis, and we also have a monthly growth rate, and then we've got a monthly churn rate. The churn rate is something that really throws a lot of people off. The churn rate, when you talk about monthly churn, it's not how many customers from last month churned. It's how many customers last month of the total pool of customers you had the month before churned. That's what gives you your monthly churn rate. And the thing that's interesting about churn is that it's at least as important as your growth rate, because you can have scenarios where your growth rate is really high and your churn is really high and you never catch up. You're just burning money with a leaky bucket scenario and those users are falling out. Conversely, your acquisition might be really slow. You might just be like pulling your hair out saying, why is this thing not growing as fast as I want it to? I need to reinvest in acquisition. But if you've got pretty good retention, that you can push the problem down the road for a while because your customers that you get are sticking around. Okay. So I talked to a founder recently who had 2% monthly churn, but is struggling with acquisition. And I was like, look, that's okay for now. You're going to need to figure out acquisition, but if your churn is that low, it means that the customers that you do figure out how to get, they stick around. So with this model, again, it's just a couple more rows. You end up with a monthly recurring revenue metric here, which is just total number of active subs in that month. So here, row 4, it's 118 times the subscription cost per month. If you've got multiple different subscription plans or, back in the transactional model, if you've got different pricing, try to find a blended average that works. That'll kind of get you by for a little while. So use a blended average. Like, what's the average subscription cost? Like, I know what our average subscription membership cost is broken down on the monthly basis, and that's slowly going up over time. But every month it changes by a couple dollars, which is kind of cool to watch. So I plug that into our model when we look forward. So you track your MRR, and again, I'm looking at marketing budget. Then what you can start to do is you can say, okay, year 1, I'm going to make $100,000. Year 1, I need $100,000 in marketing budget. Year 2, year 3, et cetera, et cetera. So you can literally just drag these rows out for 2, 3, 4, 5 years and pull the model forward. And that becomes part of your decision point when you're thinking about, well, how am I going to go about and actually get customers? Now, so this is 10% churn. Now here's 20% churn. So notice what happens. The revenue, look at this box right here, this year 1, 99,176, all of a sudden down to 79,336. But the problem gets worse over time. So the problem with churn, it's a sneaky problem, because high churn in months 1 or 2, it happens. Like, we need to figure these things out. You put your product out there. But high churn after a year or after 18 months or 2 years, if you're not getting control over that, you may be in a spot where you can't really catch your model up to get you to a point of profitability or hit those acquisition targets. Like, if you're going for monthly recurring revenue as your main metric, you may find that your churn is actually preventing you from reaching that, even if you've got great customer acquisition. Here's a monthly view. So I'll let you kind of look at this for a second. I mean, look at the end months. Look at like month 12. So it's not a huge difference yet, but it is still material, I would say. Your MRR at the end of your 20% monthly growth with 10% churn is 20,000 in MRR. With 20% churn, you're down to 16,000. So it's roughly a 25% reduction in MRR at the end of that year. And that's only based on a 10% churn difference. Now, if your churn is 5% and you're comparing it to 30% churn, it's a totally different business. Like, the business feels really different when you're running it. And we'll share some benchmarks and stuff on churn and stuff like that in week 4 when we talk about more of our retention strategies. But your annual view here is, same marketing budget, but in year 3 with 10% churn, you do almost, you do over 9 million in revenue. And in year 3 with higher churn, you do 6.8 million. And this is off a $29 a month subscription. And if you hack and tweak this model, what you'll find is that generally the higher the cost of your unit economics, the more negative impact churn is going to have actually on your model moving forward. So our stuff is $150 a month or $1,500 annual. Churn becomes a very big problem for us if it's high at that rate, because our volume is so much lower compared to some, a startup who might be doing similar stuff that charges $10 a month. maybe it's a more watered down version of what we're doing, right? So we have to be mindful of these things. Now, again, difference in churn on that low price subscription is material in revenue. Now, as you find product market fit, though, your retention actually should get better. Like, a lot of folks say, oh, you can't really impact retention. You can't change retention. Retention's impossible to change. That's just not true. That's just not true. There's some great ways to increase retention, to fix retention problems, to find gaps and holes. Frankly, having a better product helps with a lot of that. And having better marketing and better onboarding helps with that too. So it can be done. So if you have a churn problem right now, and if one of the reasons why you joined this program is because you've got a churn problem and you know that, congrats that you know it, because a lot of founders don't know it. And they find out in year 3, the reason why they went out of business is that they they figured out how to get customers, but they couldn't keep them around. Usually we can tell, our gut tells us that there's a problem here. Now, when I'm modeling this, I like to go a little bit higher with churn. And then try to be realistic with your model and then adjust as you go. And so, the other thing is that I normalized every month in our growth rate. So when you look at my model, it showed like 20% growth every single month or 12.5% growth every single month. And that generally doesn't happen in real life, but you need to start somewhere. So like we use that we have a 22.5% stretch goal for Growth U that we set out for. We're happy anywhere from a 5 to 20% growth rate. If we're learning, if we're at 5% growth and we've learned something in that prior month, we're happy with that because we know that like the next month is probably going to be better or 2 months down the road because we've learned something about why that growth rate didn't match what we thought it could. And conversely, our current churn is lower than I had modeled out because we didn't have data. So I didn't know where to start. So this is totally normal to kind of like fluff your way through it a little bit and test and iterate and just be ready to recast that growth model based on your data as you move forward. Now, the next thing you want to think about is your budget needs. And so contrary to what you read on TechCrunch, most of us do not have endless capital to deploy into growing our startups. So things like CAC, growth rate, and churn become our main drivers of what we look at. And I like to kind of roll in a couple more elements here. And again, this is not meant to replace a P&L, but notice here in yellow, I've added this marketing budget in, and I can kind of show my year 1, 2, 3 marketing budget. I roughly know at my given customer acquisition cost, how much money I'm going to need to spend. So it's like, how much do you have to spend on that plus all of your P&L costs? And you basically can come up with like what I call a scratch budget. And so you take your marketing budget, you take your headcount costs, and you try to build a loose model that helps you predict what your cash needs are going to be, right? Because if you run out of money and you can't pay people, if you're bootstrapped, then they probably disappear. If you've raised money and you don't have the traction metrics and you can't raise more money, that's a problem. So just be mindful. How much is in your bank? How much is your spend on marketing? How much is your headcount spend? What are all your other costs? And what's that scratch P&L? Are you profitable each month? Or how much money are you pulling out of the bank every month? And then it's like, how much money do you have in the bank divided by the total burn? That scratch P&L basically becomes your burn rate. How much money am I losing every month? That gives you a sense of what's my runway. How much do I have left with the money that I have in the bank before I go raise more money or before I go get a bunch of new customers paying the bills for me? And again, you're going to want to adjust this as you get data. So more regularly early on as you learn more. I mean, we probably adjust our model once a week at this point. I'm constantly plugging numbers. It probably drives my team crazy. But we have to do this because not everything is just running itself yet. We're pretty early stage as well. And a lot of different factors are going to impact that growth rate. So use this as a benchmark. And I will say, like, there's, the reason why the Launch Accelerator is now using this material is because if you're trying to raise money, you have to be able to clearly communicate with an investor what the heck is going on under the hood in your business. And it's not just like, hey, I have this amazing product. This is really weedy, detailed stuff. But the reason why all these companies are using this now is because it gives folks a common starting point to build and then adjust your model based on. And then once you have that, knowing it's not perfect, we move into acquisition and activation and doing all of the things that we need to do to impact and influence that model. So your homework is to download the growth dashboard Excel sheet that we've got. It's in our CMS. And I would love for you to build your version 1 of your growth model. And you'll have an opportunity to put it in front of me and or the group in an upcoming accountability session. Probably not this Friday, but probably the Friday after that. This is going to take you a little while to get through. You're going to probably iterate a few times on this. If you spend a couple hours on your growth model, updating the plug and play template that we give you, doesn't need to be perfect, but it will change the way you think about growing your startup. So the things to keep in mind are, what are my capital needs? How fast can we grow? What signals do we have on growth? There's a module that I used to run that I would run in next week's session that I just pre-recorded, and it's part of the curriculum now that I would strongly encourage you to watch. It's called Building Your IO Model. And what this is going to do is it's going to take basically your financial and growth model, but it's going to challenge you to think of different acquisition scenarios that will lead to growth for your company. And when you plug all of those acquisition scenarios together, what you want to have happen is you hope that set of activities that you're going to go out and do matches whatever you said you're going to do in your growth model. And if you said, hey, my startup's going to grow 20% every month, or I'm going to bootstrap and we're going to get to $50,000 in monthly revenue by the end of 2022, I would challenge you to think about how you're actually going to do that. And if you've got lessons that you've learned from running experiments or talking to customers or running paid acquisition, use that to build into your model and be honest with yourself and with your teammates about what it actually looks like. And again, we're constantly changing this at GrowthU. What we thought was going to happen is not what happened. Other things surprised us, both positively and negatively. And we've adjusted our model as we go. And you're going to need to do the same thing. And so that's your homework for the week, is to build that growth model. I'm less concerned with seeing your financial model. Like, I trust that you've got something already. So feel free to use the materials that we'll provide you for the financial model. But the growth model, I would love to see. It's not required. But if you just send me a Slack message, send me an email, upload it into our system as the homework module. The system will give you a queue to basically upload your homework. I will look at every single one that comes by, and I've seen hundreds of growth models of different startups in all sorts of industries, and I will give you candid feedback on it. I'll do a quick screen record, and I'll give you video-based feedback on it, or we can set up one-on-one time. So please, please, please take this part seriously, and because as we move into acquisition and when we get into channel marketing and all the other stuff, if you don't have this down, then you're going to be playing catch up for the rest of the program. So that's it.